In a neighborhood where tension between law enforcement and residents runs deep, one moment of unchecked prejudice threatens to tear a community apart. When Officer Riley Stone's ingrained biases lead to a shocking confrontation with respected Pastor James Wright, both men's lives change forever. But what begins as an act of violence opens the door to an unexpected journey of redemption, forcing everyone involved to confront hard truths about justice, forgiveness, and what it truly means to protect and serve. Before we dive into this story, let us know in the comments where you're watching from today. And if the story resonates with you, don't forget to hit that subscribe button to never miss out on more stories like this one. Officer Riley Stone's patrol car crawled through the streets of Oak Grove, his knuckles white against the steering wheel. The morning sun had barely crested the horizon, but already the summer heat pressed down on the aging neighborhood. Through his tinted windows, he watched residents beginning their day, his jaw tightening with each passing face. Another day in paradise, he muttered, logging his 7th hour on patrol. The dashboard computer chirped with updates about overnight incidents. 2 break-ins, a domestic disturbance, and a handful of noise complaints. Riley's mind automatically cataloged these as further evidence, supporting his predetermined conclusions about the predominantly black neighborhood. The radio crackled. Dispatch to Unit 274. Check on a possible disturbance at Marshall and Pine. Unit 274, copy that, Riley responded, making a sharp turn toward the intersection. As he approached, he spotted a young black man walking briskly, hands in his pockets. Riley's suspicion immediately kicked in. "Hey, you there," he called out, rolling down his window. "Stop right there." The young man froze, slowly turning around. "Yes, officer. Where you headed in such a hurry?" Riley's tone carried an edge that made the question sound more like an accusation. "I'm just going to work, sir. I'm opening the hardware store today." Riley sized him up, noting the clean polo shirt and name tag. "ID," he demanded. The young man carefully reached for his wallet, movements deliberately slow. "My name's Marcus Thompson. I've worked at Johnson's Hardware for 3 years now." Riley snatched the license, scrutinizing it before tossing it back. "Get moving, and keep those hands where I can see them." Marcus nodded, face carefully neutral as he continued down the street. Riley watched him go, mentally adding another tally to his list of suspicious characters for the day. 2 blocks away, a very different scene was unfolding. Pastor James Wright walked his usual morning route, his presence bringing smiles to faces that had been tense moments before. At 62, he carried himself with the dignity of a man who had seen both the worst and best of humanity and chose to believe in the latter. "Good morning, Mrs. Henderson," he called out to an elderly woman struggling with several grocery bags. "Those look heavy. May I help?" "Oh, Pastor Wright." Mrs. Henderson's weathered face brightened. "You're too kind, but I couldn't impose." "Nonsense," he said, already taking the heaviest bags. "My grandmother would rise from her grave and box my ears if I walked past a lady in need." His warm laugh drew chuckles from nearby residents. As they walked, Mrs. Henderson shared news about her grandchildren, her arthritis, and the neighborhood's latest happenings. Pastor Wright listened attentively, offering gentle advice and words of encouragement. "You know, Timothy got accepted into college," she said proudly. "First in our family. That's wonderful news." Pastor Wright beamed. "I always knew that boy had potential. We'll have to recognize him at next Sunday's service." After helping Mrs. Henderson into her house and ensuring she was settled, Pastor Wright continued his walk. He passed the corner store where a group of young men often gathered. Some people avoided this spot, but Wright saw beyond the surface. "Morning, brothers," he called out to the small group assembled there. Among them was Darius, a former student of his youth program, now working 2 jobs to support his younger siblings. "Pastor Wright," Darius straightened up. "We were just talking about the community center project. Is that right?" Wright moved closer, genuinely interested. "What ideas do you have?" The young men gathered around him, their earlier restless energy channeling into animated discussion about basketball courts and after-school programs. None of them noticed Officer Riley's patrol car approaching until it was too late. Riley had been watching the group from a distance, his mind already constructing scenarios of drug deals and gang activity. The sight of Pastor Wright among them only fueled his anger. He pulled up sharply to the curb, lights flashing. "Break it up," he barked, stepping out of his vehicle. Everyone dispersed now. Pastor Wright turned calmly, maintaining his peaceful demeanor. "Good morning, officer. Is there a problem?" Riley's eyes narrowed. "Yeah, there's a problem. You're encouraging loitering and potential criminal activity." "Sir, we're having a discussion about community improvement," Wright explained, his voice steady. "These young men are sharing ideas for the new community center, right?" Riley scoffed. "And I'm sure those improvements involve more places for dealing drugs and causing trouble." The young men tensed, but Pastor Wright raised a hand slightly, a silent signal for calm. "Officer Riley, I've known these young men since they were children. They're working hard to make positive changes in their lives and their community. You're enabling them." Riley shot back, stepping closer, making excuses for their behavior. "This is exactly why this neighborhood stays the way it is." People began emerging from nearby shops, drawn by the confrontation. Phones appeared in hands, recording the scene. The tension in the air grew thick enough to cut with a knife. "Officer," Wright said firmly but respectfully, "these are good young men who deserve our support, not our suspicion. If you take the time to know them." "Know them?" Riley's voice rose. "I know enough. I see what goes on here every day. And you're supposed to be a man of God. Instead, you're out here encouraging this nonsense." "What I encourage," Wright responded, "is hope, dignity, and community. These are values that benefit everyone, including law enforcement." Riley's face reddened. "Step away from the group now, or I'll arrest you for obstruction." "I cannot and will not abandon these young men simply because you misunderstand their intentions," Wright stated calmly. "If you'd like to join our discussion about improving the community, you're welcome to do so." The crowd had grown larger now, murmuring and shifting. Some began calling out in support of Pastor Wright, while others filmed the confrontation on their phones. Darius and his friends stood their ground, but their faces showed increasing concern. "Last warning," Riley growled, his hand moving to his belt. "Move away from them now." Pastor Wright stood his ground, hands open at his sides. "Officer Riley, there's no need for threats here. We can discuss this like reasonable." The sound of the slap echoed through the street like a gunshot. Riley's hand had moved faster than anyone could track, connecting with Pastor Wright's face with enough force to snap his head to the side. Gasps and shouts erupted from the crowd. Wright slowly turned his face back to Riley, a red mark blooming on his cheek. But what struck Riley most was the look in the pastor's eyes. Not anger or hatred, but something that looked unsettlingly like pity. The crowd surged forward, voices raised in anger, but Wright raised both hands. "Peace," he said firmly. "Peace, everyone. Violence solves nothing." Riley stood frozen, his hands still tingling from the impact. For the first time, doubt crept into his expression as he looked at the faces around him. Not criminals or troublemakers, but shocked and horrified community members, all ages, all recording his actions. Without another word, he backed away, nearly stumbling in his haste to reach his patrol car. As he pulled away from the curb, his eyes met Pastor Wright's in the rearview mirror. The calm, steady gaze seemed to follow him, burning into his conscience like a brand. The crowd gathered around Pastor Wright, offering help and expressing outrage, but he remained focused on the departing patrol car. He touched his cheek gently, then turned to address the agitated group. "My friends," he said, his voice carrying across the now silent street, "what happened here today is not the end of the story. It's the beginning. How we respond in the next few minutes, hours, and days will determine whether this moment becomes another spark for division or an opportunity for real change." As the morning sun climbed higher over Oak Grove, news of the incident began spreading through social media and text messages. The video of the slap would soon go viral, but few who shared it would understand the true significance of that moment. How a single act of violence would set in motion events that would transform not just two men's lives, but an entire community's understanding of justice, redemption, and the power of unwavering grace in the face of hatred. In his patrol car, Riley Stone tried to shake off the memory of Pastor Wright's eyes, but it clung to him like a shadow. He didn't know it yet, but in 8 minutes, he had set in motion a chain of events that would force him to confront not just his actions, but the deep-rooted prejudices that had led him to this breaking point. The real question was, when the truth finally caught up with him, would he be ready to face it? The crowd's reaction was immediate and electric. Dozens of phones captured the moment, their screens reflecting Pastor Wright's reddened cheek and Officer Riley's retreating figure. Among the onlookers, 23-year-old Malik Johnson pushed through the crowd, his voice rising above the chaos. "Everyone stay back," Malik called out, reaching Pastor Wright's side. "Give him some space." He'd known the pastor since childhood, when Wright's youth programs had kept him off the streets and in school. "Pastor Wright, let me help you," Malik said softly, supporting the older man's elbow. "We should get you checked out." Mrs. Henderson emerged from her house, clutching a bag of frozen peas. "Bring him to my porch," she insisted, her voice trembling with anger. "I saw everything from my window. We should call the police." "The real police." No, Pastor Wright said, allowing Malik to guide him to a nearby bench instead. His voice remained steady, though his cheek had begun to swell. "What we need right now is calm." "Calm," someone shouted from the crowd. "That cop just assaulted you in broad daylight." Murmurs of agreement rippled through the gathering. Someone mentioned calling their cousin who worked at the local news station. Another suggested organizing a protest right then and there. "My friends," Pastor Wright stood, his presence commanding attention despite the circumstances. "Violence solves nothing. We fight hate with love." He touched his cheek gently. "This pain is temporary, but the choices we make now will echo through our community for years to come." Malik noticed several people shaking their heads, unconvinced. He understood their frustration. He felt it himself. But he also recognized the wisdom in Pastor Wright's words. "The pastor's right," Malik addressed the crowd. "But that doesn't mean we do nothing. We can fight back with truth." He held up his phone. "We have video. We have witnesses. We'll make sure everyone knows what happened here today." Already, social media was lighting up with clips of the incident. Sarah Martinez, who ran the community center's social media accounts, was among the first to share the video. Within an hour, it had been shared thousands of times. At the First Baptist Church, Deacon Thompson watched the video with growing concern. He immediately began calling other church leaders. "We need to organize," he told them. "Pastor Wright has stood up for this community for 30 years. Now it's our turn to stand up for him." By early afternoon, church members had organized a peaceful protest scheduled for the following day outside the police station. The message spread through neighborhood group chats, church newsletters, and word of mouth. Stand with Pastor Wright. Stand for peace. Meanwhile, Officer Riley Stone sat in his patrol car 3 blocks from the station, trying to steady his breathing. His hands still tingled from the impact, and Pastor Wright's eyes haunted him. Finally, he put the car in drive and pulled into the station parking lot. Inside, the atmosphere shifted as he walked through. Conversation stopped. Officers looked away. His partner, Detective Sarah Chun, approached with concern in her eyes. "Riley, what happened out there?" "The captain's looking for you." "Nothing happened," Riley muttered, pushing past her. "Just another day dealing with troublemakers in that neighborhood." "There's video," Chun warned. "It's all over Facebook." Before Riley could respond, Captain Martinez's voice boomed across the precinct. "Stone, my office. Now." Riley entered the captain's office, where the incident video played on a computer screen. Martinez paused it at the moment of impact. "Explain this to me," Martinez demanded, his face tight with controlled anger. "Tell me why one of my officers is on social media assaulting a respected community leader." "Sir, the situation was volatile. Pastor Wright was encouraging a group of known what, Stone? Known community members? That man has done more to reduce crime in Oak Grove than 10 police officers." Martinez leaned forward. "We've already received dozens of complaints. The mayor's office is calling. They're just stirring up trouble." Riley insisted. You know how that neighborhood is? No, Stone. I'm starting to think you're the one stirring up trouble. Martinez rubbed his temples. Go home. Take administrative leave while we sort this out. The drive home felt surreal. Riley's phone buzzed constantly with notifications, social media messages, many of them hostile. By the time he reached his driveway, his hands were shaking. Inside, his wife Linda watched the local news with horror. Breaking news tonight, the anchor announced, as video surfaces of a local police officer assaulting beloved community leader Pastor James Wright. Turn it off, Riley snapped. They're saying you hit a pastor. Linda's voice cracked. Tell me that's not what happened. Riley paced the living room. You don't understand what it's like out there. These people, they don't respect authority. They gather in groups, plotting God knows what. These people, Linda interrupted. Riley, Pastor Wright baptized our nephew last year. Remember? At the joint service with First Baptist? The memory hit Riley like a physical blow. He remembered Wright's warm smile, the way he'd made their nephew feel special. But that was different, wasn't it? That was in church, not on the streets where what? The question nagged at him as he lay in bed that night, replaying the incident. He'd seen a group of young men talking about community programs. He'd seen a pastor trying to mediate. No. He pushed the thoughts away, replacing them with familiar anger. He was the officer. He was in charge. They should have listened. But even as he clung to his justifications, doubt crept in like smoke under a door. Across town, Pastor Wright sat in the Channel 5 news studio, makeup artist carefully concealing his bruise. The younger members of his congregation had urged him to show it, to let everyone see what had happened, but Wright had other ideas. Pastor Wright, the interviewer began, today's incident has sparked outrage across the city. What's your response to those calling for Officer Stone's immediate termination? Wright's calm demeanor provided a stark contrast to the day's chaos. My response is that we must be careful not to let one moment of anger destroy the possibility of many moments of understanding. Are you saying Officer Stone shouldn't face consequences? I'm saying that consequences and punishment are not the same thing. Officer Stone's actions reflect deeper issues that termination alone won't solve. What we need is dialogue, understanding, and yes, accountability, but accountability that leads to change, not just punishment. The interviewer leaned forward. Some in the community feel you're being too forgiving. They want justice. Justice and revenge are different paths, Wright replied. I choose justice, and sometimes justice requires us to see the humanity in those who fail to see it in us. Social media exploded with reactions. Some praised Wright's grace and wisdom, while others accused him of being too soft. The video clip spread further, reaching national news outlets. The next morning, Riley woke to find his supervisor, Lieutenant Sandra Hayes, at his door. We need to talk, she said, stepping inside. The department is opening a formal investigation. Given the video evidence and public pressure, we don't have much choice. Riley slumped onto his couch. So that's it? 20 years on the force, and I'm done because of one incident. One incident? Hayes' voice sharpened. Riley, I pulled your complaint history. This isn't isolated. It's just the first time it was caught on camera. What are you saying? I'm saying you have a choice to make. The department psychologist has an opening this afternoon. The union lawyer will be here in an hour. And Pastor Wright? She paused. Pastor Wright has offered to meet with you. Riley looked up sharply. He what? He called this morning. Said his door is open if you want to talk. Hayes stood to leave. Think about it, Riley. Really think about what kind of officer, what kind of person you want to be. Left alone, Riley stared at his hands. The same hands that had struck a man of peace, a man who now offered him a chance at redemption. For the first time since the incident, he allowed himself to feel something beyond anger and defensiveness. It felt like shame. Outside his window, he could see news vans gathering. His phone showed hundreds of unread messages. The wall of justification he'd built around himself was crumbling, leaving him exposed to a truth he'd spent years avoiding. In 8 minutes, he had destroyed his career and reputation. But as he finally forced himself to watch the full video of the incident, he realized he'd been destroying something far more important long before that: his own humanity. The question was, could he find it again? The answer, though he didn't know it yet, would depend on his willingness to see through Pastor Wright's eyes, the same eyes that had haunted him since that morning, offering not condemnation, but a chance at transformation. As the sun set on the second day of this unfolding drama, two paths stretched before Officer Riley Stone. One led to defensive isolation, the other toward uncomfortable but necessary change. The choice he would make would affect not only his own future, but the future of a community balanced on the edge between conflict and reconciliation. And somewhere in Oak Grove, Pastor Wright prepared for another day of healing. Not just his own visible wounds, but the invisible ones that ran deep through the heart of his beloved community. The morning sun cast long shadows across the police station steps as hundreds of community members gathered, their signs held high against the pale blue sky. Peace, not violence, justice with love, and community unity dotted the crowd like flowers in a garden of hope. Pastor Wright stood at the center, his bruised cheek now a reminder of why they had gathered. Despite attempts to conceal it, the mark remained visible, a testament to the truth they sought to address. The crowd parted as he made his way to the front, his presence bringing a hush over the assembled masses. "Let us pray," he said, his voice carrying across the morning air. Heads bowed, regardless of faith or belief, united in a moment of reflection. "Lord, we gather here not in anger, though we feel it, not in hatred, though it tempts us. We gather in hope, hope for understanding, hope for change, hope for healing. Guide us toward justice that transforms, not vengeance that destroys." Amen. Amen, the crowd echoed. Inside the station, Officer Riley Stone watched through Venetian blinds, his throat tight. The sight of hundreds of peaceful protesters, grandmothers, children, business owners he recognized, challenged the narrative he'd constructed about the neighborhood. "Quite a turnout," Detective Chin commented, passing his desk. Her tone was neutral, but her meaning clear. She'd been his partner for 5 years, but now she'd barely met his eyes. "Sarah," he started, but she kept walking. Throughout the day, similar moments repeated themselves. Officers who usually shared jokes with him found reasons to be elsewhere. Conversation stopped when he entered the break room. Even rookie officers who once sought his advice now avoided him. During the afternoon briefing, Captain Martinez addressed the elephant in the room. "The department is committed to maintaining positive community relations," he announced, his gaze sweeping the room, but notably skipping over Riley. "Any officer whose actions compromise that commitment will face appropriate consequences." The message couldn't have been clearer if he'd used Riley's name. Meanwhile, at First Baptist Church, the evening meeting drew a capacity crowd. Pastor Wright stood at the pulpit, his presence as commanding as ever despite the week's events. "I see the anger in our community," he began. "I feel it too. But anger is like drinking poison and expecting the other person to die. We must transform this moment into movement, this pain into progress." Mrs. Henderson stood up. "But Pastor, how can we trust the police after what happened to you?" "By remembering that Officer Stone is one man, not the entire force," Wright responded. "By engaging with those officers who want to build bridges. By being the change we seek." Near the back, Jamal Washington, a young community activist, shook his head. "With all due respect, Pastor Wright, we've tried that approach. How many more incidents before we demand real action?" Murmurs of agreement rippled through the crowd. The division was palpable. Younger members calling for protests and demands, older ones supporting Wright's measured approach. "I understand the frustration," Wright acknowledged. "But consider this. If we respond to hatred with hatred, when does it end? We must be bold enough to imagine a different path." Not everyone was convinced. Outside after the meeting, Jamal gathered with other young activists. "Pastor Wright's earned his respect, but times have changed. We need more than prayers and patience." The group began planning their own response. Peaceful, but more demanding than Wright's approach. The community's unity, already strained by the incident, showed signs of fracturing along generational lines. For Riley, the breaking point came in an unexpected form, a letter in his mailbox. The handwriting was neat, the tone respectful but direct. Dear Officer Stone, you won't remember me, but 3 years ago, you detained my son Marcus for fitting the description. He was 16, walking home from band practice with his trumpet case. You held him for 2 hours while I frantically searched for him. When I finally found him at the station, you dismissed my concerns with a wave of your hand. That night, my son cried himself to sleep, not from fear or anger, but from disappointment. Mom, he said, I did everything right. Why wasn't it enough? Watching the video of you striking Pastor Wright brought back that night. How many others have similar stories? How many children have asked that same question? I don't write this in anger. I write because I saw something in your eyes after you struck Pastor Wright. A flicker of doubt. Maybe, for the first time, you're questioning things too. My son is in college now, studying criminal justice. He wants to be the kind of officer he needed that night. I pray you find the courage to become that kind of officer too. Sincerely, Angela Turner. Riley read the letter 3 times, each reading hitting harder than the last. Memories surfaced, not just of Marcus, but dozens of similar incidents he dismissed or justified. The weight of years of unchecked bias pressed down on him like a physical presence. The next morning, the city newspaper featured an open letter from Pastor Wright. Riley's hands shook as he read. To our community, in recent days, many have asked why I advocate for reconciliation rather than retribution. The answer lies in a truth I've learned over 62 years. Hate cannot drive out hate. Only love has that power. The incident that occurred was not just about 2 men, an officer and a pastor. It was about the fears, prejudices, and misunderstandings that divide our community. Officer Stone's actions were wrong and require accountability. But accountability without transformation perpetuates the cycle. I envision a community where police and residents work together, where trust replaces suspicion, where every person's dignity is recognized and respected. This vision requires courage, the courage to change, to forgive, to grow. To those calling for punitive action, I hear you. Your anger is valid. But consider this. What serves our community better? Punishment that isolates or accountability that transforms? To law enforcement, we invite you to walk with us, not against us. Let this moment be a catalyst for real change. To Officer Stone, my door remains open. Sometimes the hardest path and the right path are the same path. In faith and hope, Pastor James Wright. The letter sparked intense debate online and in the community. But for Riley, its impact was overshadowed by what awaited him at home. Linda stood in the kitchen, their children's backpacks on the counter. They're not going to school tomorrow, she announced, her voice tight with emotion. What? Why? Why? Because Tommy came home crying today. Some kids were saying his dad is a racist cop who beats up pastors. Sarah's teacher had to stop students from showing the video in class. Linda's composure cracked. Our children are paying for your actions, Riley. Do you understand that? Riley slumped into a chair, the full weight of consequences finally hitting home. His career, his reputation, his family, all affected by 8 minutes of unchecked bias. I don't know how to fix this, he admitted, his voice barely a whisper. Maybe that's the problem, Linda replied. You're so focused on fixing things, you never stop to understand them. The next morning, as Riley sat alone in the precinct's break room, a young man walked in. Riley recognized him immediately, Malik Johnson, the one who had helped Pastor Wright after the incident. Officer Stone, Malik said politely, do you have a moment to talk? Riley's instinct was to refuse, to maintain the walls he'd built. But something in Malik's demeanor, the same calm dignity he'd seen in Pastor Wright, gave him pause. Why are you here? Riley asked instead. Because Pastor Wright taught me something important. Change happens through conversation, not confrontation. Malik met his eyes steadily. I thought maybe you'd like to have a real conversation about what happened and why it matters. Riley looked at the young man before him, seeing not a threat, or a stereotype, but a person extending a hand across a divide he himself had helped create. For a moment, he considered taking that hand, bridging that gap. Instead, he stood up. "I have work to do," he muttered, walking away. But as he left, Malik's voice followed him. "When you're ready to talk, we'll be ready to listen." That's what community means. Those words, like Pastor Wright's steady gaze, like Angela Turner's letter, like his children's tears, added another crack to the foundation of prejudice Riley had built his career upon. The question was no longer whether that foundation would crumble, but what he would build in its place. As the sun set on another day in Oak Grove, the community remained divided, but not broken. In churches and community centers, in police stations and living rooms, people wrestled with questions of justice, forgiveness, and change. And somewhere between the extremes of unconditional forgiveness and unrelenting punishment, a path forward waited to be found. For Riley Stone, that path still seemed hidden in shadow. But for the first time in his career, he was beginning to question whether the light he'd been using to see the world had been illuminating truth or casting shadows of its own. The blue light from the television cast shadows across Riley Stone's face as he sat alone in his living room at 3 a.m. Linda and the kids were upstairs sleeping, but rest eluded him. On the screen, Pastor Wright's interview played for what must have been the dozenth time. "Forgiveness isn't about forgetting," Wright was saying. "It's about creating space for change. When we hold on to hatred, we become prisoners of our own anger." Riley reached for the remote to turn it off, then stopped. Something in Wright's eyes held him, the same steady gaze that had followed him since that fateful morning. "Many ask why I don't demand Officer Stone's termination," Wright continued. "But what does that solve? We remove one officer without addressing the deeper issues. True justice isn't about punishment. It's about transformation." Riley's hand trembled as he picked up his coffee mug, now cold and bitter. The words echoed in his mind, mixing with memories. Angela Turner's letter about her son, Malik's calm offer of conversation, his own children's tears. "What does that solve?" he whispered to the empty room. The next morning his phone rang. The caller ID showed Captain Martinez. "Stone," he answered, his voice rough from lack of sleep. "Riley." Martinez's tone was unusually gentle. "I've got Pastor right here in my office. He's requesting a private meeting with you." Riley's throat tightened. "I don't think. He's not here to press charges or demand anything. He just wants to talk." After a long pause, Riley spoke. "When?" "Tomorrow morning. The community center. Neutral ground." Another pause. Riley thought of all the reasons to refuse. Pride, fear, anger. But underneath it all, exhaustion. Bone-deep weariness from carrying the weight of his defenses. "Okay," he heard himself say. "What time?" The community center stood quiet the next morning, its usual bustle of activity suspended for this private meeting. Riley arrived early, parking his personal car around back to avoid attention. His uniform felt wrong today, so he'd worn civilian clothes, a decision that left him feeling strangely vulnerable. Pastor Wright was already there, sitting calmly at a table in the main room. A few chairs, 2 cups of coffee, and decades of institutional distrust between them. "Officer Stone," Wright greeted him, gesturing to a chair. "Thank you for coming." Riley sat stiffly, not touching the coffee. "You wanted to talk. So talk." "Actually," Wright replied, "I'd like to listen first. Tell me, how are you handling all this?" The question caught Riley off guard. He'd expected accusations, demands, maybe even smugness. Not this simple inquiry about his well-being. "How am I handling it?" Riley's laugh held no humor. "My career is probably over. My kids are being harassed at school. The whole community hates me, and you're the one who turned them against me. Did I?" Wright's voice remained gentle. "Or did your actions that morning simply reveal something that was already there?" "You don't understand what it's like," Riley shot back. "Dealing with the crime, the attitudes, the constant disrespect. May I share something with you?" Wright interrupted softly. "A story from my own life?" Riley gestured vaguely, and Wright began. 1978. I was a young seminary student, driving home from evening classes. A police officer pulled me over, said I matched the description of a robbery suspect. I showed him my ID, my seminary documents, explained I was studying to become a pastor. Wright's eyes grew distant with memory. He called for backup anyway. Made me lay face down on the cold pavement while they searched my car. Found my Bible in the trunk and threw it on the ground. 2 hours, they kept me there. 2 hours of humiliation, simply because I matched a description. Riley shifted uncomfortably. The story was too familiar. How many times had he used those same words? Matched a description. The next Sunday, Wright continued, that same officer walked into my church. He didn't recognize me at first. When he did, I saw shame flash across his face. He turned to leave, but I called out to him, asked him to stay for the service. Did he? He did. And the next week, and the week after that. Today, he's one of my dearest friends. He chairs our police community relations committee. Riley stared into his untouched coffee. Why are you telling me this? Because that officer made a choice. When confronted with his prejudice, he could have doubled down, defended himself, blamed me. Instead, he chose to change. Wright leaned forward. We all have choices, Officer Stone, even when our past seems to dictate our future. Something broke in Riley then, a dam holding back truths he'd never voiced aloud. My father, he started, his voice barely audible. He had very clear ideas about people who were different from us. Growing up, every family dinner included some rant about how those people were ruining the neighborhood, the country, everything. Wright listened silently as Riley continued. I thought I was different, thought I'd moved past all that. But every time I patrol certain neighborhoods, every time I see a group of young black men, I hear his voice in my head. And I hate it. I hate that I can't seem to shake it. Tears threatened, but Riley fought them back. I'm ashamed of what I did to you, yes, but of all of it. Every traffic stop where I was a little rougher than necessary. Every time I assumed the worst. Every kid I might have traumatized like Marcus Turner. He looked up at Wright. How do you even begin to fix something like that? Wright reached into his briefcase and pulled out a small notebook. First, by acknowledging it, which you've just done. That's crucial. He began writing. I'm going to give you some resources. Dr. Sarah Martinez, no relation to your captain, is a therapist who specializes in helping people unlearn ingrained biases. She's helped several officers I know. He continued writing. There's a weekly discussion group at the community center. People from all backgrounds talking about their experiences with race and prejudice. And I know a retired officer who runs workshops on community-oriented policing. You really think any of them will want me there? After what I did? They might be skeptical at first, Wright admitted. But authentic change inspires others. Your journey could help other officers confront their own biases. Riley picked up the list with trembling hands. I don't know if I'm strong enough for this. Strength isn't about never falling, Officer Stone. It's about how you get back up. Wright's smile was gentle. The first step is always the hardest, but it's the most important. What if I fail? Then you try again. Change isn't a destination, it's a journey. And you don't have to walk it alone. They talked for another hour, discussing practical steps and potential challenges. Wright shared more stories, both of prejudice faced and bridges built. Riley found himself opening up about his fears, his shame, and his hope for redemption. As their meeting drew to a close, Wright mentioned one final thing. We're having a community forum next week. It's not about you specifically, but about building understanding between law enforcement and residents. Would you consider attending? Riley's initial instinct was to refuse. The thought of facing the community he'd wronged terrified him. But something had shifted during their conversation. Not to speak, Wright added, seeing his hesitation. Just to listen. Sometimes, hearing other stories is the most powerful catalyst for change. Riley thought of Angela Turner's letter, of Malik's offered conversation, of all the voices he'd dismissed over the years. What time? Thursday evening, 7 o'clock. Right here, standing to leave, Riley extended his hand. Thank you, Pastor Wright. Not just for today, but for seeing something in me worth saving. Wright took his hand firmly. God sees worth in all his children, Officer Stone. Sometimes we just need help remembering that includes ourselves. Outside, the morning had warmed, the sun breaking through early clouds. Riley stood in the parking lot, Wright's list clutched in his hand, feeling both lighter and heavier than when he'd arrived. Lighter, freed from the burden of denial. Heavier, weighted with the responsibility of change. His phone buzzed, a text from Linda. How did it go? Riley looked at the community center's doors, where Pastor Wright was now talking with the morning cleaning crew, treating them with the same dignity he'd shown to the officer who'd struck him. I think, Riley typed carefully, this might be the first day of something important. As he drove home, Riley's mind was already working through what came next. Calling Dr. Martinez to schedule an appointment, researching the discussion group, preparing himself mentally for the community forum. The path ahead would be challenging, uncomfortable, probably painful at times. But for the first time since that morning when his hand had struck Pastor Wright's face, Riley felt something he'd thought he'd lost forever. Hope. Not hope that everything would quickly return to normal. He understood now that normal had been part of the problem. Instead, hope that through the difficult work of transformation, he might become something better than he'd been before. Hope that his children might see their father not as someone who fell, but as someone who had the courage to get back up and try again. The community center shrank in his rearview mirror, but Pastor Wright's words echoed in his mind. The first step is always the hardest, but it's the most important. Riley Stone had taken that step. Now came the journey. The community center's meeting room buzzed with tense energy as people filed in for the forum. Riley Stone stood in the back, his civilian clothes doing little to hide his discomfort. Every face that turned his way carried recognition, and few of them were friendly. He's got some nerve showing up here, someone muttered loud enough for him to hear. Mrs. Henderson, arranging chairs near the front, caught his eye. For a moment, her expression hardened, then softened slightly as she noticed his obvious anxiety. She gave him a small, almost imperceptible nod before returning to her task. Pastor Wright approached the podium as the room filled to capacity. The bruise on his cheek had faded but remained visible, a reminder of why they were all there. Good evening, Wright began, his voice carrying to every corner. Tonight is about building bridges, not walls. About understanding, not accusation. He paused, scanning the room. We have someone here who has chosen to take a difficult but necessary step. Officer Riley Stone. The room erupted in whispers and shifting chairs. Riley felt every eye turn toward him. Officer Stone is here not as a police officer, but as a man seeking redemption. I ask that you grant him the same grace you would hope to receive in your own moments of transformation. Wright gestured for Riley to come forward. Each step felt like walking through deep water, the weight of hundreds of eyes pressing against him. At the podium, he gripped the edges, his knuckles white. His voice cracked. He cleared his throat and started again. I've spent 20 years as a police officer, believing I was serving justice. But I wasn't. I was serving my own prejudices, fears, and biases that I didn't even want to admit I had. The room remained silent, waiting. That morning, when I struck Pastor Wright, I didn't just assault a respected community leader. I betrayed everything a police officer should stand for. I betrayed this community. I betrayed myself. Riley's voice strengthened as he continued. But that moment, that shame, it forced me to look at myself. Really look. At every traffic stop where I was too aggressive. Every young man I profiled. Every time I let my father's racist views color my judgment. He looked directly at the crowd now. I can't undo those actions, but I can own them. I can change. I'm in therapy now, learning to recognize and challenge my biases. I'm here tonight to listen, to learn, and to begin making amends. Not just for that one moment, but for all of them. The silence that followed felt endless. Then, from the back of the room, Malik Johnson stood up. Actions speak louder than words. Officer Stone. How do we know this isn't just damage control? We don't, Riley admitted. I can only prove it through consistent action, day by day. I'm here to listen to your stories, your experiences. I'm here to learn. Gradually, people began sharing. Stories of harassment, of fear, of dignity stripped away, each one hitting Riley like a physical blow. He forced himself to listen, to really hear them. By the end of the evening, something had shifted in the room. Not forgiveness, exactly, but perhaps the beginning of possibility. Weeks passed. At Pastor Wright's suggestion, Riley began mentoring at the youth center. His first session was with Malik, who had agreed to give him a chance. These kids, Malik explained, showing Riley around, they need to see authority figures who respect them, who believe in them. The way Pastor Wright believed in me when I was their age. Riley watched a group of boys playing basketball. I used to see groups like this and automatically assume they were up to no good. And now I see kids being kids. And I wonder how many lives I affected with those assumptions. The mentoring program grew. Riley found himself looking forward to his sessions, watching young men like Marcus Turner, Angela's son who he'd wrongfully detained, grow into leaders. Each interaction challenged his old perspectives, replacing fear with understanding. 3 months after the forum, Pastor Wright approached Riley with an idea, a community police cookout in the park. Not just handshakes and photos, Wright explained. Real conversations, games, breaking bread together. The event drew hundreds. Police officers and residents played basketball together. Children got to sit in patrol cars, not in fear, but in excitement. The aroma of grilled food filled the air as people shared meals and stories. Linda watched from a picnic table as Riley helped a young girl adjust her grip on a basketball. Their own children played nearby with kids they'd once been warned to avoid. He's different, Linda told Pastor Wright, who had joined her. Happier somehow, more at peace. Change, when it's real, transforms everything, Wright replied. Not just actions, but the heart itself. The event's success caught the mayor's attention. At the next city council meeting, she presented Pastor Wright with the key to the city. Through his unwavering commitment to peace, forgiveness, and understanding, she announced, Pastor James Wright has shown us that true leadership isn't about power. It's about wisdom, compassion, and the courage to build bridges where others see only walls. Wright accepted the honor humbly, but his speech focused on the community's collective effort toward change. In the audience, Riley sat with his family, Linda squeezing his hand as Wright acknowledged their journey together. The recognition sparked interest from other police departments. Riley found himself invited to speak at training sessions, sharing his story as a cautionary tale that became a roadmap for change. It's not comfortable, he told a room full of officers in a neighboring city. Confronting your own biases never is. But comfort isn't what we signed up for. We signed up to protect and serve all citizens, not just the ones who look like us or live in certain neighborhoods. His story resonated, particularly with younger officers. Several departments began implementing new training programs focused on bias recognition and community engagement. Riley's journey from aggressor to advocate became a case study in police reform. 1 year to the day after the incident, Riley walked into First Baptist Church. The evening light filtered through stained glass windows, casting colorful shadows across empty pews. Pastor Wright sat in his usual spot, reading glasses perched on his nose as he reviewed his Sunday sermon. Got a minute? Riley asked softly. Wright looked up with a warm smile. Always. They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, the kind of silence that can only exist between two people who have traveled a difficult road together. I've been thinking about that morning, Riley finally said. How close I came to destroying everything. My career, my family, my soul. You saved my life that day. Wright shook his head gently. You saved your own life, Riley. I just showed you the way. How did you know? Riley asked. That I could change? Because I saw something in your eyes after you struck me. Not hatred, fear. Fear of what you'd become. And where there's fear of darkness, there's still love of light. Riley nodded, understanding. There's still so much work to do. There always will be, Wright agreed. But now you're doing it for the right reasons. Through the windows, they could see people gathering for the evening's community meeting. Malik helping Mrs. Henderson up the steps. Linda arriving with their children, Captain Martinez and several officers in civilian clothes, young activists and longtime residents, all coming together in this space of healing and hope. "Thank you," Riley said simply, standing to join them. "No," Wright smiled, rising as well. "Thank you for having the courage to change. That's the real miracle here." As they walked together toward the gathering, Riley reflected on how far he'd come from that morning a year ago. The journey hadn't been easy. Some community members still viewed him with suspicion. Some officers still called him a traitor. Change, he'd learned, rarely pleased everyone. But for the first time in his career, in his life really, he felt authentic. The weight of prejudice he'd carried for so long had been replaced by something lighter. Hope, understanding, and a commitment to continuing this journey of transformation. Outside the church, the setting sun painted the sky in shades of purple and gold. Pastor Wright paused at the top of the steps, looking out over the neighborhood he'd served for so long. Riley stood beside him, no longer an outsider looking in with suspicion, but a part of this community's ongoing story of resilience, redemption, and change. "Ready?" Wright asked, though they both knew he meant more than just entering the building. Riley nodded, thinking of all the work still ahead, the minds to change, the bridges to build, the trust to earn. "Ready?" Together, they walked into the church where their community waited. Not a perfect community, but one committed to the difficult, necessary work of transformation. One story of redemption at a time. If you found this story compelling, please consider subscribing to my channel. Every story I share is crafted with care to inspire, move, and spark meaningful conversations. Your support not only keeps this journey alive, but also brings us closer as a community. Thank you for watching, and I can't wait to bring you more incredible tales soon.